Good morning, sunshines. This morning we're going to listen to a book called The Honeymakers by Gail Gibbons, and it actually has so many facts about honeybees, and I bet that you already know a lot of the information that we're going to learn about in this book. So we've been talking on Seesaw about starting our projects, and today, instead of taking notes, although I do want you to pay attention to new information, today I want you to start thinking about how you can show all that you've learned about insects. And I'm going to include some examples at the end of our Seesaw lesson, just so you can kind of see, like, what project are you talking about, Miss A? So there are lots of different ideas that you can do at home, and I really can't wait to see. So for the rest of this week, we're just going to be reading for fun, and then you're going to be working on your projects instead of doing a Seesaw lesson for read alouds. Okay, so let's read The Honeymakers. It is springtime. Two beekeepers have placed a hive on a hill. Activity begins around the hive. The honeybees and the beekeepers are the honeymakers. Honeybees travel to and from the hive. Their earliest ancestors lived about 80 million years ago. The scientific name for honeybee comes from the Latin words Apis mellifera, meaning honey bearer. Honeybees are social creatures. They form highly structured groups called colonies. In a colony, as many as 50,000 or more bees live together and work at their own special jobs. Many honeybees like to make their home in dark, enclosed places. Often, a colony of wild honeybees builds its hive in a hollow tree. That reminds me of that National Geographic article we looked at together. Honeybees cared for by today's beekeepers live in box-shaped wooden hives. Inside the beehive, the honeybees are building an amazing structure called a honeycomb. It is made up of countless six-sided cells. Stored in many of these wax cells is the food that bees and people love to eat, honey. Three different kinds of honeybees live inside all beehives. There's one queen, about 100 male drones, and thousands of female worker bees. Like all insects, bees have three body parts. There's the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. Honeybees have other parts too. You can see here that there are all of the other parts of the honeybee are labeled. The stinger, the proboscis. Oh, and it talked about their eyes too. We'll get there later. The queen is the largest of the honeybees, and she can live the longest, from 3 to 5 years. All the other bees in the colony live for about 2 months, except over the winter time, when they live a few months longer. It is the queen's job to make sure the hive never runs out of bees. To do this, she leaves the hive to mate with her drones. Then she lays as many as 2,000 eggs a day. Drones are usually smaller than the queen. Their only job is to mate with her. Most cells in the beehive are used for storing honey, but some are used for the queen to lay her eggs. These are called brood cells. In each brood cell, a bee will develop and grow. The largest brood cells are queen brood cells, also called royal cells. Drone brood cells are smaller. Even smaller are the worker brood cells. The eggs in those cells will become worker bees. Although all worker bees are female, they do not lay eggs. Instead, they do the work of the beehive. Most eggs the queen lays are no bigger than the period at the end of this sentence. After 3 days, a larva hatches from each one. For the next 3 days, worker bees called nurse bees feed the larva bee milk. Then they feed it bee bread. A queen larva is fed royal jelly throughout its whole entire life cycle. Oh, and it tells us what those things are. Bee milk is a milky syrup that is full of nutrition. It is made by glands inside the nurse worker bee. Bee bread is a combination of pollen and honey. Royal jelly is made the same way as bee milk, but it is even more nutritious. Each larva grows quickly, then spins a silky cocoon around itself. Inside the cocoon, a pupa develops. A nurse bee seals the cell with wax. Little by little, the pupa changes. It begins to look more like an adult insect. This process is called metamorphosis. Queens develop in about 16 days from the times the eggs are laid. The metamorphosis of drones and workers takes about 21 to 24 days. Finally, after the transformation is complete, an adult bee chews its way out of the brood cell, an adult honeybee. This honeybee is a worker bee. From the minute she comes out of her brood cell, she is as busy as a bee. For the next 3 weeks, she will have a number of different jobs to do inside the hive. First, she is a house bee, cleaning and polishing the cells. About 3 days later, she becomes a nurse bee. After 10 days of being a nurse bee, she becomes a wax-making bee. She makes flakes of wax in her abdomen and chews them to mold new cells or repair old ones. Wax-making bees are also in charge of storing the nectar and the pollen that the other honeybees bring back to the hive. Other workers care for the queen. They are her court. They cluster around the queen to make sure she's okay and continually feed her and groom her. About a week later, the wax-making bee becomes a guard bee and begins its outdoor life. Guard bees protect the hive. They chase away intruders with their stingers. They also alert the other bees by spreading a special scent when there is danger. A guard bee will sometimes die in battle to protect the hive and its honey. The worker bee is now about 3 weeks old. She's ready to become a forager bee. Her last job, but a very important one. Forager bees are the bees you see zipping from flower to flower. They collect sweet juices called nectar from the flowers for honey making. At each flower, the forager bee collects nectar with her proboscis. She stores the nectar in a special part of her body called the crop, or the honey stomach. This stomach is separate from her other stomach where she eats and digests food. As she goes from flower to flower, she comes in contact with a yellow powder called pollen. Some of the pollen is collected in little baskets formed by the special hairs on her hind legs. As the forager bee collects nectar, she carries pollen from flower to flower. This is part of the process called pollination. When she's visited many flowers and her crop is full, she beelines back to the hive. You can see the pollen baskets there. Back inside the hive, the forager bee brings up or regurgitates or vomits the nectar. Then she transfers it by tongue to a hive bee. The nectar is passed by tongue among the hive bees until some of its moisture is gone. Then a wax-making bee places the nectar in a honey cell. There it continues to dry. More and more nectar is added to the honey cell. House bees cluster over the cell and fan their wings to evaporate even more of the moisture in the nectar. As the nectar loses water, it becomes thicker and thicker. Finally, wax-making bees cap or seal the cell with wax. Slowly, the nectar ripens into honey. When forager bees return to their hive, they have a special way of telling the other forager bees of important discoveries, like a new location of flowers full of nectar and pollen. They do the dances of the bees. There's the circle dance and the wagtail dance. A forager honeybee can visit up to 10,000 flowers a day. All the nectar she collects in her entire life can make only 1 teaspoon of honey. To make 1 pound of honey, it takes nectar from over 1 million flowers. Also, different kinds of honey come from different kinds of flowers. Work really hard for us. Honeybees have always been valued for the honey they make. For thousands of years, people have stolen honey from wild beehives. People became beekeepers when they began to make their own hives. Some used hollow logs, others used clay pots. Later, in about 1500, European beekeepers started using upside-down basket hives called skeps. Then, in about 1850, the hanging movable frame beehive was invented, and this is the one we see most often today. On top of the hill is a modern beehive. The beehive is stacked in sections. In each section hang about 10 wooden frames. This is what they look like, where the bees build their honeycombs. To help the bees build their honeycombs faster, the beekeeper places wax foundations in the frames. It is time for the beekeepers to harvest the honey. The honeybees have had several months to build and fill their honeycombs. The colder the winter, the more food they will need. The beekeepers move slowly around the hive. They wear special clothes and use special equipment to protect themselves from getting stung. They wear white coveralls. They wear a helmet with a veil and gloves. And sometimes they use this special smoker that sends out smoke to calm the bees down. Back at home in a shed, the beekeepers use a hot knife to cut the wax caps off the honeycomb. Then, the honeycomb frame is placed inside an extractor. It spins around at a really high speed to remove the honey without breaking the honeycomb. The honey goes into a collecting tank. There's the extractor that spins, and you can see a little spout of honey coming out. Next, the honey is filtered through a screen and a cloth to remove small pieces of wax. Then the honey is packed in airtight jars. Sometimes beekeepers melt down old and damaged honeycombs to make beeswax candles and other things. The rest of the empty honeycomb frames are returned to the hive for the honeybees to fill again. There are all the extra frames. For some beekeepers, honey making is a hobby. They use the honey themselves or they give it away as gifts. Commercial beekeepers provide stores and shops with gleaming jars of their product to sell. Delicious sweet honey from the honeymakers. And that is the end of this book. There are some interesting facts at the end, like a yearbook and telling you what happens year-round. I'll take some pictures and show you guys that. And then here's some interesting facts as well. And I'll take a picture of this page and show you that. Just has fun, interesting things. For example, about 8,000 years ago, Greeks used the honeybee as a design on coins. So, looking forward to that. Now, I can't wait to see all the ideas for your projects. Can't wait to see your projects, and I hope everybody has a wonderful, amazing day. See you later.